You are listening to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I am Adam Young, and I am joined today by my friend Bethany Robbins. Bethany, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you so much. It's good to be here.
So you were here before. You shared one of your stories in episode 78. And if folks want to go back and listen to that, they can find out a lot more about you from episode 78. And you're going to share a story today. We both are. We're both going to share a short story today. The story you're going to share is when your mom broached the subject of sex with you as a sixth grader. And then we're going to transition to talking about how your story, my story, people's stories as a parent, how your story as a parent is playing out in the way you talk to your children about sex or don't talk to your children about sex. So the main theme that we want to kind of emphasize right from the beginning is that your story is profoundly influencing how you are talking to your children about sex, particularly your story around your sexuality and sexual shame. And we all have sexual shame. So before we dive in, Bethany, you just mentioned that there might be a little background noise because you are currently living where?
Yeah, so we have just relocated to Malawi, which is in Southeast Africa. Yes, so there might be some background noise.
And that background noise might be which two animals?
Monkeys and hyenas. We get hyenas around this time of day. It's evening for me.
Okay, so just an FYI to the listeners, if you hear background noise, we can't do anything about the monkeys and the hyenas.
That's right.
All right, let's talk about how this episode came to be. You emailed me a couple weeks back, and why'd you email me and what'd you say?
In the past, I've had many parents approach me for help with sex education. I think it often, the requests come because they've maybe overheard me using correct terminology, or maybe they've heard me having small side conversations with my kids about sex or reproduction or menstruation. It's not uncommon for me to talk about these things with my kids in public. And so maybe some parents have overheard me talking, and maybe they've seen that my kids weren't horrified as I'm talking to my kids about sex. And so they've come to me for advice, like, how are you able to have these conversations so easily? What is happening? When do you educate your kids on this? So that's one reason. But as well, in my work at the Allender Center, there are many adults that share with me they've never had a sex talk with their parents. Or if they did, it was much too late and much too awkward. So what I've been finding as I talk to parents about their fears, they've told me that they're afraid that they might introduce their children to too much too soon. So they're unsure of when to have these talks. They're also worried about talking about pornography or abuse because they say that they feel like they are introducing harmful topics and ideas to their kids before their children might even know about these things. And I think that the truth is that these parents are failing to realize that their kids are actually like growing up in a sexualized society and that their kids have sexual bodies. So I believe there are many ways to engage these topics without doing harm and without planting fear in your child. And so, over time, through many conversations, some of these parents realize it can be really good and right to empower our kids with skills and knowledge that they're going to need for the world that they're growing up in and living in.
Let's get on the ground level for a bit with story. I'd like to share my story of the one time my father talked to me about sex. And then you can share your story, Bethany, and we will just reflect on these together. I was probably in eighth grade. I don't really remember my exact age, but I think about eighth grade. And here's my point in saying that. I already knew a ton about sex from peers at school and movies by the time my dad broached the subject of sex with me. And that in and of itself is deeply problematic. I mean, I needed my dad to talk to me about sex and sexuality before I had discovered, learned, some things good, some things erroneous, but had learned a whole lot about it from other sources. And I longed for my dad to talk to me about sex. I mean, I longed for my dad's voice, period. But I remember in middle school, wanting, when we'd have like sex ed at school, wanting dad to talk to me about sex. Here's how the conversation happened. I remember where I was. My dad called me over to the family room and we were sitting on the floor. And my dad was kind of smiling with an awkward smile. And what he said was, "Now, Adam, do I need to talk to you about the birds and the bees?" And in that moment, what I was most aware of was two things. Number one, my deep longing for my dad to talk to me about anything substantive, sex, God, spirituality, his work, anything substantive and meaningful. I was starving for my dad's voice. So, hell yes, I wanted my dad to talk to me about sex. That was my answer internally. But I was also aware of how massively uncomfortable dad was with the subject. And since one of my jobs as a boy was to be highly attuned to my father's insides, to his emotions, to his moods, and to make him feel better inside, I knew that I couldn't say, "Yes, Dad, I need you to talk to me about sex. I need you to initiate me as a boy into the mysteries of manhood. I'm dying for you to guide me." Those were the words that were truly inside of me, but I knew that I couldn't say that because that would make Dad feel unpleasant feelings. And one of my jobs was to protect him from those feelings. And so, with a nervous smile on my face, I said, "No, I don't think so." And that was the end of our sex talk. So, Bethany, what do you notice as I share the story?
Yeah, my heart drops to know that that was the end. That was all that was offered. And I just was struck by even the way he begins it. Do I need to? Do I need to do this thing for you? Something you're so longing for. And it's so different from like, Adam, I want to talk to you about something so amazing and really wonderful. And I can't wait to share this with you and bring you into this part of humanity, of being a human. But he begins by like begging you to give him a way out.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you already know he doesn't want to talk about it in the way that he offers that, right? Yeah, it just felt like your dad brought up sex at the very last possible moment too. Like he'd be putting it off as long as he could. And clearly it was like too late. It was much too late. And I think he knew that. Yeah. In 8th grade, like you're not needing him to explain sex, like what sex is, right? But you're needing him to now give language to any arousal or curiosity that you might have felt, that you might have already experienced up to that point. Yeah, he could have offered you wisdom and life experience to guide you and protect you, and help you make sense of what you've already been exposed to. But yeah, I think he knew he was coming into the conversation much too late.
And my guess is that my mom told him, "You need to talk to Adam about sex." That's my guess. He clearly did not want to have this conversation, but I desperately wanted him to talk to me about sex. A child needs their parents to engage them on this topic, whether the child wants to listen or not. Like the choice can't be left up to the child. That's cowardice on the part of the parent if they leave it up to the child. And one thing that is gut wrenching for me about this story is how brilliantly my father made me complicit in not getting the sex talk. Because after all, if you look at the story just on the surface, he offered to talk to me about sex and I said no. It's not, in other words, an outsider looking in might think, it's not that dad failed me as a father. He did his part. He offered to talk to me about sex, but I said no. So I walk away from the experience feeling like it's my fault that I didn't get my father's voice, that I didn't get my father's guidance, that I didn't get any talk about sex. But what's the truth? The truth is that my dad had so groomed me to be attuned to his discomfort and his fragility and his inadequacies that by this age, by 8th grade, I knew my role was to never make him do something that would make him feel uncomfortable. That would make him feel uncomfortable. So, what are you feeling or thinking as you're listening, Bethany?
I think I just feel the heartache of that moment because you're longing for his voice. And then you hear him use the phrase birds and bees instead of using the word sex. He can't even come to use the word sex. So already I feel like at that moment you would have known like that he's uncomfortable. He can't even use
Right.
the word, right? And I think when parents use silly phrases and words to like sidestep the truth, kids pick up on that. You would have picked up on that and noticed the awkwardness. But I think not because sex is intrinsically awkward, right? It's because your dad could only say birds and bees.
Right. And the fact of the matter is, sex is incredibly uncomfortable and awkward for many, many parents. But like you said, there's nothing intrinsic to the subject of sex that makes it awkward. What makes it awkward is our stories of sexual shame, our stories of sexual development, and the immense discomfort we have with our sexual story. And then we become parents, and all of a sudden, we're thrust into this realm of how do I know I need to talk to my children about sex. I want to do it right, quote unquote. And what I want to suggest, and we'll get into this more in a minute, but you can read all the right books or watch the right movies on how to talk to your kids about sex or follow the right Instagram people that are telling you how to do that. But if you have not engaged your own sexual shame and your own sexual story, that is going to leak out no matter what words you use, what great sentences you say. And I really want to emphasize that. Would you agree, Bethany?
Absolutely, yeah, because you can use the right terminology and say all the right things, but what's on your face, if you're struggling with your own disgust or your own shame or your own fear, your kids are going to see that.
And they're going to pick up on it because they have right hemispheres and they read your right hemisphere. And that stuff gets communicated between the two of you, regardless of how accurate or how kind of correct your conversation is, the words that you choose are. The nonverbal communication of your sexual shame gets shed into the room, and your kids pick up on that. Okay, let's leave my story, at least temporarily, and shift to yours, because you've graciously agreed to read a story that's longer than mine. You've written it out about the time your mom talked to you about sex. Would you be willing to read it now, Bethany?
Yeah. I remember being surprised that my mother had allowed me to go to my 6th grade dance. I wasn't allowed to wear makeup, but I could make my hair look nice. This was my opportunity to try to look pretty and silence the kids who called me Frog Girl. Yes, my eyes were still bright green and way too big for my young face. No dress could change that. I was tall, thin, and completely flat like a piece of paper. I couldn't change that either. Still, I imagined I was Cinderella, allowed to be beautiful for just one night. At the dance, my 3 friends and I took a group picture in front of the photographer's cheesy backdrop. Mariah Carey played continuously over the loudspeaker as an older boy asked me to dance. My friends told me he liked me. Something of it felt nice to be chosen and noticed. I had butterflies in my stomach. But as we danced, he pressed into me, and I felt repulsed, like he could do anything he wanted, and I couldn't say no. At the end of the dance, most of the kids were standing outside where our school buses usually lined up. Parents were getting their kids, and I was waiting a while for mine. I felt someone take my hand and turn me around, and without much notice, the boy I had danced with was kissing me. No, he wasn't kissing me. He was all over my face, sloppily trying to mimic what he'd seen in the movies. His spit and slobber ran across my cheeks. Again, I was repulsed and pulled away. He held on to me and continued until he was satisfied. I stood there stunned. I had no words. I'm sure my green frog eyes were bulging out of my head. He walked away, and I was left to wipe him off of me. The next week, my mom called me into the laundry room. She had found something in the pocket of my jeans while doing the washing. It was a note I had written to my friend about kissing, and I don't remember if it was about the boy at the dance or someone else. I only remember it was about kissing because of my mother's response. "Is this your note?" my mom asked. I think so, I admitted. My face became hot, and I didn't know where this was going. I just remember feeling as though I was in big trouble. I'm not sure if she said much else, but the next sentence is what stood out to me. "You need to know that kissing leads straight to sex." Again, I'm stunned. My eyes grew big. What in the world is she talking about? I legitimately didn't understand what she meant. After mumbling a in agreement, I walked away in a panic. Had I done something sexual? With that boy at the dance, were we about to have sex? I felt terrible. I felt wrong and disapproved of. What did that mean about me? This wasn't my first kiss anyway. I had been slobbered on by older boys before, regularly, in fact. That's another story, but this was the first time my mother had talked to me about sex and kissing and boys in general. A wave of nausea came over me, and I was left alone to worry about it in my room, careful to never write another note at school again.
Hmm. Thank you for reading that, Bethany. There's a lot in this story that we're not going to engage today. That we don't it's just not the focus of today's, but I just need to name a couple of things before we focus in on the part with your mom at the end of the story. No, number 1, you're a 6th grader who feels beautiful having made your hair pretty and gotten all dressed up for this dance. And that's a big deal for a 6th grader. And that's how the story starts. Uh, Number 2, you feel immense powerlessness as this older boy presses into you and you feel repulsed by it. You don't like it. And then after the dance, he assaults you and you try to pull away, but you can't. And then he marks you. He marked you with his slobber all over your face. And as you put it in your story, you had to wipe him off of you after he left. So again, we're not going to focus on that today. That's another podcast, perhaps, but I just couldn't let it go unnamed. What's happening for you as I say these things, Bethany?
Yeah, I think I'm just thankful for you naming those things. In reading the story, just remembering how young I was
Mm-hmm.
and clearly not thinking about sex or kissing at all when I'm getting ready for the dance, even when I'm at the dance. I don't think I even expected to be asked to dance by a boy. So I'm just happy to be there with my friends. And I think that's such a sweet young girl that I've come to really love and embrace.
So is it okay to have some dialogue about the second part of the story,
Sure.
which it happens a week after the dance? Your mom finds a note in your blue jeans doing laundry. And it's a note that you had written to a friend, and it says something about kissing. And so your mom calls you into the laundry room and she asks you, "Is this your note?" What happened inside that 6th grader when mom said, "Is this your note?"
Yeah. I just remember panicking. Like I remember the look on her face and immediately knowing that I was in really big trouble. And I couldn't even remember what the note was or if it was my note, but I knew I had done something wrong and I felt caught.
And your mom's response to this note is to say a fascinating sentence. Bethany, you need to know that kissing leads straight to sex. Now, before exploring your mom's response to you, I just am curious what happened inside of that sixth grader when your mom said, you need to know that kissing leads straight to sex.
Yeah, I think there was just more panic. Like my mind starts racing through all the moments I'd ever been kissed or slobbered on by a boy. I was stunned. I'd never heard her say the word sex before either. So, I'm going through all my memories. I mean, I had been um, sexually abused regularly from the time I was 8. So for some years now, I had been experiencing this, but I'd never told anyone, especially my mother. So I was shocked to find out that all of this slobbery kissing and touching was sex. I didn't realize that's what maybe I was doing. I knew that like sex brought babies. So I was worried that maybe I was pregnant. Maybe I could be pregnant. Of course, I hadn't started my period yet. I was still quite young, but I didn't even know about that either. I didn't know anything about menstruation. So, I think back to the dance in that moment. I'm thinking, gosh, was I going to have sex or was I even having sex? Like, what is happening in front of all the parents and kids? Like, can you even do that? I think I was just really confused and afraid.
Yeah, and as you're talking, what strikes me the most is that we have to name like the immense innocence of that girl. You didn't know what your mom was talking about. And you're thinking to yourself, "Oh my gosh, if what mom is saying is true, if kissing leads to sex, then that means I was about to have sex out in the parking lot with that boy who assaulted me at the dance." Like that's how innocent your brain is. You're confused. You can't make sense of what's being told to you because you don't know adult things yet. You're just an innocent sixth grader who doesn't know about these things yet. Let's talk a bit about mom's sentence. First of all, just to identify the obvious, it's untrue. Kissing doesn't lead straight to sex. Your mother, of course, knows this. So, why in the world is your mom telling a sixth grader, her daughter, that kissing leads straight to sex?
Yeah, even as you bring that up, I just start laughing because it's preposterous. It's a ridiculous thing to say. It's also heartbreaking because I think it just sheds light on how my parents parented us. They used fear. Fear was like the main tool in their toolbox. Instead of educating or empowering in order to protect me, she uses this ridiculously fearful, even accusatory sentence. By that time, I had already internalized, I think, that sex was a bad thing, likely learning that from my church community. I didn't really know much about sex, obviously, but I remember seeing panic and fear in her eyes.
Hmm.
And I don't know if you've seen Fantastic Mr. Fox, but it reminds me of the line where the wife says, "If what I think is happening, it better not be." And it was that kind of face of like, kissing leads straight to sex, and so don't even touch a boy ever. Just very fearful. And yet I had no idea what was happening. So clearly, she had a lot of shame and a lot of fear around the subject because she only offered me that lousy sentence. That was it. And it was clear she was trying to terrify me to keep me from ever kissing anyone.
And she's using massive hyperbole and flat out inaccurate, correlation causations to tell you, to scare you into not kissing, because if you kiss, you're going to have sex. And the whole thing is like warning sign, like danger, like don't do this. But what we know, I mean, it's just so obvious from this story, Bethany, is that your mom has immense shame about her own sexuality. And she is, quote unquote, parenting you out of her story. That's what's happening in the laundry room. What are your thoughts on that sentence, on that claim?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely true. I don't know my mother's stories of harm around her sexuality, but I believe there are likely many stories of harm. I think what's so painful for me is because of her fear and shame, she missed such a beautiful opportunity to be curious about my heart and to like actually find out um, about what happened that night and that I was assaulted that night. And she could have offered me comfort and put language to my disappointment and the repulsion, right? She had such a beautiful opportunity to give a good definition of sex and kissing and the connection between the two and give me a vision for what it should have been like with this boy. But instead, I just grew up believing that sex was when boys take things from you. And I think I internalized a lot of shame and believed I wasn't worthy of much more than that. At 10 years old, I already had so much contempt for my body. Like I was mocked for my large green eyes. Boys constantly talked about my undeveloped body, that I was flat like a piece of paper, right? And so I already had multiple experiences of being forced into sexual acts as well without any knowledge or language for it, not understanding what was happening to me. Even at that young age, like my intuition told me that my parents weren't safe people to tell. And then by 10, yeah, my young heart, like in the story, you can just see my young heart so desirous to be chosen and beautiful at the same time, right? And so both of those things are happening at the same time. And this story just validated my gut feeling that my mom was not safe. She could not handle this story about the dance or any of my earlier abuse stories.
And that's one thing we need to emphasize is that your discomfort, a parent's discomfort with their own sexuality, with their sexual shame, unprocessed sexual shame, not only is that going to make it hard to talk to your children about sex, do sex education, but there's another piece that you're putting language to, Bethany, and that is you knew inside as an 8, 9, 10-year-old girl that it's not safe to talk to your mom about the sexual abuse that you're experiencing. And that's, I mean, that is beyond tragic. And so for the parents out there, like, you need to understand there is so much at stake in engaging your own sexual shame and your own sexual story, because you want your children, if they experience sexual harm or sexual assault or sexual abuse at any level, you want them to intuitively know that you're a safe person for them to go and like spill all of that story to. And as a girl, Bethany, you knew that it wasn't an option talking to your mom. And so you were alone with all that abuse.
Yeah, and I think I became very hidden. I became very secretive. Everything became internalized, and I didn't share anything with my parents from that moment on. It just communicated to me that they couldn't handle anything difficult or anything messy. I couldn't bring it to them.
It's hard to overstate the loneliness of that bind for a 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 year old. The bind of, I've got all these big feelings because big stuff is happening in my world, like sexual abuse, and I can't bring it to my mother. I can't bring it to my father. That bind puts you in an immensely lonely place where you're having to hold and carry secrets that are too much to bear.
Yeah, I hear that in your story too.
Yeah, I knew that talking to my dad about sex was just not an option. It just wasn't going to be helpful. I knew that. Nothing good would come of it. And so there's an immense loneliness in that. We are going to pause here. In the next episode, Bethany and I will dive into the practical stuff. We will address the key points to cover when you talk to your children about sex, including the subject of pornography and the importance of naming the feeling of sexual arousal and blessing that feeling rather than communicating that sexual arousal is bad or dangerous. We will also talk about how you can gauge your own sexual health, how you can know the degree to which you are sexually whole, or the degree to which you have unaddressed sexual shame. And finally, we will give you some next steps if you want to address your sexual story and your sexual shame in more depth. Thank you so much for listening. I'm looking forward to the next episode. By the way, please consider supporting the podcast financially by becoming a premium subscriber. It costs $30 per year. And one bonus of doing this is you will receive new podcast episodes 4 weeks before they are released on Apple Podcasts and everywhere else. You can sign up right from the homepage of my website. Thank you so much. Have a good couple of weeks.